This is Focus on Africa from BBC World News. I'm Sophie Ikenye. Our top stories. Soldiers and their families perish in the deadliest plane crash in Algeria. More than 250 people have been killed. South Africa remembers anti-apartheid activist Winnie Mandela in an emotional memorial service.
She gave us her life, her commitment. She never betrayed our struggle.
Also in the program, controversy at the Commonwealth Games in Australia. 8 athletes from the Cameroon team at the Games have gone missing. Well, thanks for joining us on Focus on Africa from BBC World News. Algeria today suffered its deadliest ever air accident. A military plane crashed shortly after takeoff from Bouffarik Airport near the capital, Algiers. 257 people lost their lives. Most of those on board were army personnel and members of their families. President Abdelaziz Bouteflika has declared 3 days of national mourning. Sophie Long has more.
The burnt-out fuselage of the Aleutian military transport plane that had been carrying more than 250 people. It had been bound for Béchar, a town in southwest Algeria, close to the border with Morocco. But it didn't get very far. Shortly after takeoff, something caused it to plummet. It missed a motorway, but crashed into a field.
We had a big explosion. And then me and my neighbor drove here by car. There was very heavy smoke, and then we realized it was an airplane accident. When we arrived at the spot itself, we found piles of bodies. It's a disaster, an absolute disaster. I don't want to speak about the bodies.
Among those who lost their lives were the plane's 10 crew. Most of the passengers were military personnel, but Algeria's defence ministry said some of the soldiers' families had been travelling with them. There have been no reports of any survivors. Algeria's army chief has ordered an urgent investigation to find out what happened, what caused this military plane to crash with such catastrophic consequences. Sophie Long, BBC News.
Well, let's bring in our North Africa correspondent, Rana Jawad. Rana, is there any more information from authorities on what may have caused this crash?
Well, it's difficult to get updates at the moment because this is still in an investigation phase. You know, they've basically been collecting bodies, and at the crash site since this morning, the Defense Ministry, as mentioned earlier, has launched an investigation to find out what may have caused the crash. We only know that it was a Russian-made aircraft, probably purchased from the Soviet era, as it were, probably an old aircraft, but certainly there'll be a lot of questions as to, you know, whether it was maintained, for example. That's something for aviation specialists to look into in the next day or so as they try to determine what caused it.
Have there been any other crashes of the kind, at least not to this extent, before?
There have been other crashes of this kind before, but certainly not as big or deadly. In 2014, there was a military aircraft that crashed that was flying from Tamanrasset to Constantine, for example, that killed some people. There was also another aircraft in, excuse me, I'll just refer to my notes there, and also in 2014, a passenger flight that killed over 100 people, and another one that killed military personnel and their families, all within the space of the last 7 years. But beyond that, generally speaking, although they don't, Algeria is not necessarily reputed to have good maintenance measures. According to industry specialists I've spoken to earlier in the day, there have been some worries over how much they maintain their aircrafts, whether they're military or civilian. Their track record overall is not as disastrous as some other countries in the continent.
All right, Rana Jawad, of course, we'll be keeping an eye on that story as it unfolds. Now, part of Winnie Mandela Mandela's story and history took place in detention. She was held in a number of prisons across South Africa. Today, the country has been commemorating and remembering her.
A send-off fit for the mother of the nation. Hundreds gathered here at Orlando Stadium in Soweto for the woman known to many simply as Mama Winnie. There were prayers, songs, and stories of her life.
She was the best, she tried, and she was a great fighter. We all loved her.
Her grandson, Bambata Mandela, lambasted those he said were dragging his grandmother's name through the mud.
The people are angry. We are hurt, and we will not tolerate your defamatory messages. You must learn to respect this legendary individual who has mothered a nation instead of behaving like ungrateful children.
Many have described her as a fearless woman who took the apartheid system head-on. Rita Nzanga, who was jailed with Mama Winnie, said the anti-apartheid activist gave the best years of her life for the freedom of black South Africans.
As people gather to honor Mama Winnie, her death has provided a platform for South Africans to ask hard questions about her true legacy.
She was often labeled a controversial and divisive figure who had called for violence. But people here say she was the victim of the apartheid government's propaganda machine.
Patriarchy at its best. They were trying by all means to make sure that Winnie does not succeed as a leader.
Winnie was a very powerful woman, and I still believe that they could see that the combination between Winnie and Nelson was very strong, and the old apartheid government was not going to stand against the two.
She led the country, and she was leading from the front. Whatever happened, that doesn't affect us. All we know is the beautiful, gorgeous queen, mother of the nation.
Never afraid to speak her mind, in later years, Mama Winnie became disillusioned with the direction the country was taking.
We didn't realize how easy it was to overthrow the apartheid regime, but we did not know how difficult transformation was going to be. When we attained political freedom, we thought we were free.
It is not yet the South Africa that Mrs. Madikizela Mandela envisaged. It is, though, a very different country from the one she grew up in. Challenges remain, but those will be for the next generation to tackle. Nomsa Masego, BBC News, Soweto.
Well, my colleague Lukwesa Burak has been following developments for us in South Africa as thousands of South Africans remembered Winnie Madikizela Mandela.
Well, Sophie, thank you very much, and a warm welcome to Johannesburg. As Sophie was just saying there, a nation really paused today to remember the mother of the nation. Now, you may know that Winnie Madikizela Mandela's history and story took part in detention. She was held at a number of prisons across South Africa, and one of those was in Johannesburg. It was prison number 4, which is now known as Constitution Hill and is in fact a museum. Well, I've been along to find out a little bit more and also to discover more about this period of her life. This is the women's jail in Johannesburg, and I'm actually in an area referred to as Winnie's Yard. And it's here that Winnie Madikizela Mandela and other political prisoners from the apartheid era will have been brought to. And I just want to show you an area here to the left. This area here is where the prisoners would have been brought in.
They would have been strip searched, they would have been cavity searched. Some of them would have been taken into the single cells or the isolation cells. And some who were referred to as dangerous agitators would have been held here. It's no longer standing, but this is where one of those infamous tin shacks would have stood. Well, with me is Pius Nashimba, who works here at Constitution Hill. Pius, just tell us a little bit about when Winnie Mandela was here.
She was actually held here the first time in 1958, the second time again in 1976 with the students' uprising.
What sort of conditions would she have been held under?
She would be held under terrible conditions where people were brutalized, where people were actually humiliated, where they had to even strip in front of each other, where even exposing their bodies inside here. Solitary confinement was unbearable during that time, where ladies were actually kept for a minimum of 15 days, the maximum would be a year, even on a diet of rice and water.
So this is one of the single cells, the isolation cells at the women's jail in Johannesburg. Now, we don't know for definite if Winnie Mandela was actually held in one of these. What is abundantly clear then, I don't know if you can get a sense of it, is this feeling of claustrophobia. Imagine being held in an area like this for time that just seemed to have gone on and on. It is no surprise, perhaps, that you come in, and this has been described to me as somebody I've been speaking to, many people I've been speaking to here in South Africa, you come in a lamb and you leave an angry lion. Well, that was just one of the prisons in which Winnie Mandela was held. She was also held for 491 days, and this took place at Pretoria Central. And this is, I think, one of the most harrowing periods of her life. It was in solitary confinement. Can you imagine that? Well, I'm actually joined now by Sam Fenter. She is the co-editor of the book, 491 Days, also a senior researcher at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Sam, thank you so much. I know you're a very busy woman at the moment. First off, this book, 491 Days, there's a story in itself as to how it came into existence. Where did we find these diary entries?
Well, what happened in 2011 was the widow of Mam Winnie's lawyer at the time found them in his belongings and came to Cape Town and gave them to her in Parliament. It wasn't a book, it was just loose pages. And then she approached myself and her granddaughter, Swati Dlamini, and asked us to make it into a book. And, you know, we found a publisher and did it.
And it's not as if you could keep a diary under the noses of those jailers. I mean, she would have suffered terrible violence.
Well, she wasn't allowed to even have a pen and paper when she was in solitary confinement. She was only allowed access to them in, I think, October of that year when they went on trial. So she was an awaiting trial prisoner, and under the guise of writing notes to the lawyer about the case, she remembered what it had been like from May when she was in solitary, and she wrote a journal.
What was that process like, Sam? I mean, it must have been emotional for yourself, but especially for Mrs. Mandela.
Well, you know, she didn't. I don't think she read it again, ever. We sat with her and we asked questions. What is this? What is that? What is the meaning of this? And then there was one part that we had to ask her about. It was called The Decision. At some point in solitary, she had thought that she might take her own life. So we had to ask her about that. And she could hardly remember it, but she acknowledged that it was true. And so we went through that process with her. But we were very clear that we weren't going to sort of dredge up a lot of trauma for her.
Why was this important to her?
She wanted people to know what she went through. And when the book was published, she was so happy that finally there's this account in her own words of that period of her life.
And I suppose there must be huge demand for the book now, because we're beginning to learn more about the story. We're stopping and we're questioning the dialogue that we had been fed.
That's right. And the book is selling out all over the place. There's demand throughout the continent, in different countries. And she would have been thrilled because she always used to say to me, how's the book doing? I want to know how my book's doing. And now she can see people want it.
Sam Fenter, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your thoughts here on Focus on Africa. We'll be back shortly, but for now, let's hand back to Sophie in London.
All right, Lukwe Saburak, we'll see you a little later in the programme. You're watching Focus on Africa from BBC World News. Still to come, South Africa's gold medal success continues at the Commonwealth Games in Australia.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. All those moments like tears in rain.
I seem to be living in a time when all of the tech from my favourite childhood sci-fi films is coming true.
How do they achieve this? Witchcraft? Emojis are here to stay.
Whoa, that makes me feel quite dizzy.
Paper, scissors. I think that could catch on.
Why not tax robots? It's definitely watching. It is very immersive.
Underneath the reactor.
I'm inside Mario World.
We're going to be on a Tinder date.
They want to work out what makes a winning performance.
Whoa! Oh, I can feel the heat of the laser sword.
The future is coming. Watch Click to see it first on BBC World News.
Can I get a high five? The Commonwealth Games. Is it still relevant or is it old-fashioned? You can decide for yourself. Join me, Chris Mitchell, on BBC World News. I'll be here throughout. You can also keep up to date via the BBC Sport website and app.
I'm Sophie Ikenya and you're watching Focus on Africa from BBC World News. The top story on this program, a military plane has crashed in the Algeria, killing more than 250 people. The aircraft came down shortly after takeoff, about 30 kilometers from the capital, Algiers. Now, 8 athletes who are competing for Cameroon at the Commonwealth Games in Australia have gone missing. Team officials say the athletes have not been seen since Tuesday. One of them, a boxer, did not even turn up for his quarter-final fight. Australian Border Force officials are now searching for them. The BBC's Matthew Kenyon has more.
Well, what we can say with certainty is that Team Cameroon don't know where 8 of their athletes are. Some weightlifters, some boxers. They apparently left the athletes' village over the period of about 2 or 3 days, and the Cameroonian officials here have reported their absence to the Queensland Police. But it is important to stress that as far as the Australian authorities are concerned, these 8 people have visas to be in the country. They can go wherever they like. Only should they overstay their visas would that become a problem. Now, it's hardly unknown for athletes at major sporting events to attempt to slip away. Some claim asylum, some attempt to disappear, and some come back eventually. So we'll have to wait and see how this story pans out. But the authorities here at the moment are trying to play it down. They don't want it to be seen as a major issue.
Away from the controversy, there's been plenty for Africa to celebrate at the Commonwealth Games. South Africa's success continued on day 7 in Australia. The world champion Luvo Manyonga picked up gold in the men's long jump, setting a games record with a leap of 8 meters 41. Now his compatriot Roosevelt Samai took bronze. South Africa now have 10 golds at the Games and are up to 4th in the medals table. And Botswana picked up his 2nd gold at the Commonwealth Games on the track. Amantle Monsho was back in top form and won in the women's 400 meters final today. Monsho made a comeback a year after returning from a drugs ban. She failed a drugs test 4 years ago at the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow. Well, that's the latest from here in London. Let's take you back now to Lukwe Saburak in Johannesburg, where the memorial service for Winnie Mandela has been taking place. Lukwesa.
Thank you, Sophie. Yes, just to wrap things up for us here and to give us a final thought on the day's events, I'm joined by the BBC's very own Milton Nkosi. Milton, there had been much national debate about the manner in which Mrs. Madikizela Mandela would be remembered. Do you think today was the start of fitting tribute as we head towards Saturday?
Well, today we had many more people coming out in favor of a story about Winnie Mandela, of a liberator who helped her people get out of the yoke of racial oppression under apartheid. They were speaking quite clearly and loudly about her role in the anti-apartheid struggle, as opposed to the many accusations we had at the beginning of the week. And the argument and the debate has been going far and wide about how we remember the dead and how we remember Winnie Madikizela Mandela, the individual. But today, it was much more pointed towards a much more constructive memory and the legacy of Winnie Mandela, who fought so much, as we all know, for the freedom of black people here in South Africa.
Milton, I've had my own experience of apartheid as a child, walking the streets of Pietermaritzburg, being spat on, being told, hearing my parents say, take your children and run, when we had abuse in the streets. And I've spent the last few days here in South Africa. It's a very different South Africa. And yet, speaking to people, I heard this one phrase, this term coming up, sentence. She said, she carried the burdens and scars, so we didn't have to. And that's what we want the world to know and remember.
Yes, and they were saying as well that Winnie Madikizela Mandela did not die, she multiplied. And all across the length and breadth of this country, we saw women put on the headscarves known as the Duke here, and they've been posting it on social media in celebration of her life. So today it was much more of a fitting tribute to a woman who fought so much in spite of all the shortcomings and the flaws that we all know about, that overall her 81 years were much more about fighting for the liberation of black people rather than being the violent monster she was described as.
We're about to run out of time, but the highlight for me today was the great-grandchildren on the stage. What about you, quickly, Milton?
They were wonderful, yes. I liked when Mangosuthu Buthelezi asked the men to stand up in honor of Winnie Mandela. That was pretty powerful.
Okay. Milton Nkosi, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Now, those of you who have followed Winnie Madikizela Mandela will know that salute, her arm raised up, the Black Power salute, whatever, and in whatever way she was hitting the headlines, she always looked absolutely stunning. Well, you'd be pleased to know that we found out who the designer was, and he is Sonwabile Ndamase, and it was him who spoke to us and told her why looking immaculate was always so important for Mama Winnie.
Mama was a rock, and she stood firm for the truth, and zange ajike, she never turned around. I met her at Vilakazi Street, down where Mama was living at Orlando West. Mama actually was a very nice person. Was a very flamboyant and also very strict in terms of when she wants something. Where she was not quite happy with something, she said, "Now don't worry, this one I will wear it in another day." We designed quite a number of dresses. Mama would also create a little bit of, flairness on the garments, and also to cover her scars by dressing her Afrocentric. She was very close to her roots. Rolihlahla Mandela wouldn't be there if then Mama Winnie did not stand firm. What Mama has done, maintain the legacy. Other people, they went silent during the time of the struggle, but Mama Winnie kept the struggle and stand for the truth.
And And if you have been following coverage today, you may have noticed that a lot of women had been wearing traditional dress, and in particular that headgear. And this was a request from the Mandela family, saying we would take it as a great honour if you could give us that nod to the great woman. Well, we have got the funeral coming to us on Saturday. Focus on Africa will have a special programme looking ahead to the funeral on Friday, and of course we'll be covering it on BBC World on Saturday itself. In the meantime, from all of us here, the team here at BBC Focus on Africa, we're going to leave you with a look at some of the images of this memorable day.
She was the best. She tried, and she was a great fighter. We all loved her.
Mama, South Africa loves you. We will always love you. We will always remember you.
She didn't care of creed or color or anything.